He's saying based on the examination of the body, he cannot rule out foul play.
Have you or he asked anyone for access to those things?
Hopefully that the medical examiner will allow him to come and examine the throat, also to talk about observations that they had, and so they could share information.
There is a detail at the center of this story that demands your full attention before anything else is said. A 12-inch by 8-inch area of red discoloration, found in the deep soft tissue at the back of a young man's skull. Not on the surface, not visible to the naked eye. Hidden beneath the skin, buried in the tissue that sits directly over the occipital bone at the base of the head. That single finding, those specific dimensions in that specific location, is the most concrete, most medically documented piece of physical evidence to emerge from this entire investigation. And it was revealed for the very first time, not in a courtroom, not in a formal investigative press release, not through official channels. It was read aloud from a forensic report, in front of a packed audience, inside one of the most significant gatherings of civil rights leadership this country has seen this year. Tonight we are going to work through exactly what that finding means, what it cannot yet tell us, and how it connects to every other piece of this case: the water, the phone, the conflicting accounts, and the growing institutional demand for a real and thorough reckoning with how Nolan Wells died. This is not a story with clean answers yet, but for the first time, it has something it did not have before: a documented, medically verified, physical detail from inside Nolan's body. And that changes the nature of every question still outstanding. To understand why this moment carried the weight it did, you have to understand where it happened and why that location was chosen. The announcement did not come from a small conference room in Mississippi. It did not arrive through a quiet statement distributed to local journalists covering this case from the beginning. It came from Chicago, from the stage of the 117th Annual NAACP National Convention, a standing room crowd, national press, the full institutional attention of an organization that has spent more than a century at the center of civil rights struggles in this country. Attorney Ben Crump stood at that podium, alongside Christine and Elmore Wells, Nolan's parents. He held a forensic report prepared by Dr. Roger Mitchell, the independent pathologist, retained by the family, to conduct a second examination of their son's body. And he read from it directly, clearly, without softening. NAACP President and CEO Derek Johnson stood with them, not as a passive observer, as an active institutional presence, lending the full organizational weight of the NAACP to what was about to be said and to what the family is demanding. The choice of venue was not incidental. It was deliberate, strategic, and it is worth sitting with that deliberateness for a moment, rather than simply moving past it. Announcing a forensic development of this nature at a national convention, rather than through a local Mississippi press briefing, guaranteed something a smaller announcement never could. It guaranteed that these findings would land in front of a national audience on the very first day they were made public. That choice reflects a pattern that has defined how this family and their legal team have approached this case from the beginning. They have consistently chosen visibility. They have used public attention as a lever, not because they distrust the investigative process entirely, but because they have made the calculated decision that public pressure is currently their most reliable tool for making sure this investigation is conducted with the thoroughness it deserves. Whether that strategy ultimately delivers the answers Christine and Elmore are looking for remains to be seen. But it has been consistent, disciplined, and intentional from the very start. And today's announcement at the NAACP convention was the most significant expression of that strategy yet. Before examining what Dr. Roger Mitchell found, it matters enormously to understand who he is and why the family specifically sought him out. Mitchell is a board-certified forensic pathologist. He serves as president of the National Medical Association, the oldest and largest professional organization in the United States, dedicated to representing black physicians. He also spent 7 years as the chief medical examiner for Washington, D.C., a role that placed him at the center of some of the most complex forensic investigations the nation's capital has seen. His examination of Nolan Wells took place on July 10th. That date is important context. Nolan disappeared on July 4th during a 4th of July excursion to Horn Island off the coast of Mississippi. His body was recovered from the northwestern shoreline of that island 6 days later. Mitchell's examination followed 4 days after the recovery. That sequence matters because it tells us Mitchell was not the first forensic professional to examine Nolan's body. The state of Mississippi's own medical examiner had already conducted its initial autopsy before Mitchell ever had access. Mitchell came second. He worked from a body that had already passed through official hands, already been opened, already been examined, and in some important respects, already been altered in ways that would directly affect what he could and could not independently assess. The family's reasoning for pursuing a second independent examination was stated clearly and has been consistent throughout this case. Christine and Elmore Wells wanted someone with zero professional ties to Mississippi law enforcement. They wanted a pathologist whose findings could not be questioned on the grounds that he owed anything, professionally or institutionally, to the local systems they have expressed deep skepticism toward. A sitting National Medical Association president, brought in from outside Mississippi entirely, funded by outside resources rather than any government agency, meets that requirement as cleanly as it is possible to meet it. Whatever conclusions Mitchell ultimately reaches, his independence from the structures this family has concerns about is, on paper, about as airtight as it could realistically. If you are watching this case for the first time, or if you have been following it from the beginning, this channel is where the verified, carefully sourced updates will keep coming. Every major development, every forensic detail, every new piece of evidence examined honestly. Subscribe right now and turn on your notifications, because this case is moving, and the next update could change everything we currently understand about what happened to Nolan Wells. Do not miss it. Ben Crump read from Mitchell's preliminary report, clearly and without interpretation, layered on top. The conclusion he led with was this: cause and manner of death, undetermined, pending further investigation. That word, undetermined, is doing a significant amount of work in this story, and we are going to spend real time with it, rather than glossing over it. But first, the actual physical findings themselves deserve to be understood in their full specificity before any conclusions are drawn. Mitchell's examination included an extensive range of additional dissection procedures that were not performed during the state's initial autopsy. He examined the face, the posterior head and neck, the ribs, the pelvic region, the subcutaneous and deep soft tissue, the back, and all 4 limbs. He conducted this broader examination specifically because the decomposed state of the body meant surface bruising was no longer reliably observable. Finding what could not be seen from outside required going deeper. Across most of the body, the result of that thorough examination was the absence of findings rather than their presence. There were no bone fractures identified. There were no deep tissue injuries beyond one specific area. There were no lacerations of the skin across the body. There were no corresponding fractures to the skull. Those negative findings are not nothing. They are meaningful data points in their own right. A body that had absorbed a serious, sustained physical assault would typically show a pattern of injuries rather than a single, isolated anomaly. Fractures, multiple bruising sites, soft tissue damage in several locations, consistent with whatever specific violence had occurred. The relatively clean condition of the rest of Nolan's body narrows the range of plausible explanations. It points away from a prolonged violent attack and toward something more localized, more specific, and potentially more ambiguous in its origin. But then there is the one finding, the one detail that has no clean explanation, the one discovery that Mitchell was careful enough to specifically flag in his preliminary report, rather than treat as a footnote. During the layered dissection of the posterior neck and the back of the head, Mitchell identified a focal area of red discoloration in the deep soft tissue overlying the occipital bone. The dimensions he recorded were 12 inches by 8 inches. The location was the back of the skull. The cause, in his own documented language, is currently unknown. It is worth pausing on exactly what kind of finding this is, because it is easy to either overstate it or understate it, and both errors would misrepresent what the evidence actually shows. This is not a visible bruise of the kind most people picture when they hear that word. This is not something that would have appeared on a surface examination or been immediately obvious when the body was first recovered. This is a discoloration found in the deep soft tissue during internal dissection, tissue that sits beneath the skin and above the bone itself, discovered only because Mitchell conducted a more expansive examination than was done initially. The fact that there is no corresponding skull fracture and no laceration to the skin above the discolored tissue is part of what makes this finding unusual enough to formally document. Those absent injuries narrow the range of immediate explanations, but they do not tell us what caused what is present. The discoloration could represent an impact. It could reflect a physiological process associated with drowning itself. It could be a product of how the body decomposed over the days it spent in the water before recovery. It could result from how the body was handled during that recovery process. Mitchell's report does not claim to know which of those explanations is correct. It documents the finding's existence and flags its cause as an open question requiring further investigation. The size of this finding deserves honest engagement. 12 inches by 8 inches is not a small, easily dismissed mark. That is a substantial area covering a significant portion of the back of someone's head. Size alone is not proof of cause. A large area of deep discoloration can result from post-mortem blood pooling based entirely on how a body has been positioned and for how long. But it is also large enough that a careful, experienced pathologist would not simply note it and move on. It demands explanation. It invites questions. And it is precisely because it invited those questions that Mitchell included it explicitly in his preliminary report, designating it significant enough to flag for further investigation. Consider what this finding represents for the investigation going forward. Before this report existed, all discussion of potential physical trauma to Nolan Wells was built on secondary sources: a disputed video, conflicting witness recollections, competing theories about what may or may not have occurred on that beach. Now there is a specific, documented anatomical finding in a formal medical report, authored by a credentialed forensic pathologist. That does not prove another person harmed Nolan, but it transforms the question from a theoretical one to a forensic one. It gives investigators something concrete, something cross-referenceable, something that can be held up against the state's own autopsy photographs and notes, and eventually against toxicology results, to either explain or deepen. A forensic thread of that kind has a different quality than competing witness accounts, however emotionally significant those accounts may be. It is the kind of detail that can actually move a case forward. Crump was direct about the limitations Mitchell encountered during his examination, and those limitations deserve careful attention, because they are not minor procedural details. They are gaps with real forensic significance. The state of Mississippi's medical examiner's office had already retained certain structures from Nolan's body before Mitchell ever had access to it. Specifically, the anterior internal neck structures, the trachea, the laryngeal cartilage, the thyroid horn, and the hyoid bone were not present when Nolan's body arrived in Washington, D.C., for the second examination. The throat, in practical terms, was absent. Before drawing any conclusions about why those structures were retained, it is important to be precise about what is standard forensic practice and what is not. Retaining tissue samples and specific anatomical structures following an initial autopsy for potential additional testing or for legal evidentiary purposes is genuinely common in forensic pathology. Mitchell himself acknowledged this, drawing on his 7 years as DC's chief medical examiner. He noted that in cases where there was any concern about the condition of the throat or any potential compression of those structures, retaining them would have been his own practice as well. He also stated clearly that he does not know why the Mississippi examiner retained those structures. The issue Crump is raising is not that retention itself was improper. It is that the sequencing of the two separate examinations meant the independent pathologist arrived to find key anatomical evidence already removed from the body he was brought in to review. The hyoid bone, in particular, carries specific weight in forensic pathology. It is a small U-shaped bone at the base of the neck, and it is one of the primary structures forensic examiners look to when assessing whether strangulation played any role in a death. A fractured hyoid bone is a well-documented clinical indicator associated with exactly that kind of examination. Without access to it, Mitchell was unable to either confirm or rule out one of the specific questions his examination should have been capable of addressing directly. That is why Crump quoted the following from Mitchell's report. This pathologist cannot rule out injury to the neck as a contributor to or cause of Nolan's death. Mitchell is not saying he found evidence of neck injury. He is saying he was denied the opportunity to check because the structures most relevant to that question were not available for him to examine. Those are meaningfully different statements, and the distinction matters enormously. One would be a positive finding. The other is an acknowledged limitation, a gap where certainty should exist but cannot yet. This is arguably the single most consequential limitation in this entire preliminary report, because the neck is precisely where the most specific questions about whether Nolan may have been physically harmed by another person would have their most direct forensic answers. There is one additional absence in this report that carries as much weight as anything that is present. There was no toxicology screening conducted as part of the independent examination, and the state of Mississippi's own toxicology results, the ones meant to accompany and complete the official autopsy report, have not yet returned either. Jackson County Coroner Bruce Lind confirmed to NBC News this week that the state's autopsy remains officially incomplete, specifically because it is still awaiting those toxicology results from the medical examiner's office. Both investigative tracks, the official state process and the family's independent process, are currently stalled at the identical bottleneck, waiting on the same category of testing, neither moving faster than the other, neither able to demand the results arrive sooner. This is worth naming plainly, because it undercuts any suggestion that one side is deliberately delaying while the other moves efficiently. Toxicology takes as long as it takes. It typically requires 6 to 8 weeks to complete, and neither examiner has any mechanism to accelerate it, regardless of how much public attention this case continues to generate. To understand why toxicology is the single most critical missing piece in this investigation, it helps to understand something specific about how drowning is classified in forensic medicine. Drowning, in the language of forensic pathology, is described as a diagnosis of exclusion. That means a pathologist does not confirm it by finding direct, definitive proof of it in the body. They confirm it by systematically ruling out the other explanations first. And the primary alternative that must be ruled out is an overdose. When a person drowns, the body experiences a profound physiological crisis. Water enters the lungs. The body's respiratory function begins to shut down. As a result, fluid accumulates in the lung tissue, a condition called pulmonary edema. That fluid buildup is one of the central markers examiners look for in suspected drowning cases. The problem is that a drug overdose produces the exact same pulmonary edema through a remarkably similar physiological pathway. Looking at the lungs alone under a microscope or during a standard autopsy examination cannot reliably tell you which of those two things actually happened. Toxicology is the instrument that makes that distinction possible. There is one more layer to this that deserves honest attention. If toxicology results eventually identify a substance in Nolan's system, That does not automatically eliminate drowning from the picture. Forensically, it is entirely possible for a cause of death to be recorded as a combination of factors, drowning as the immediate physical cause, with a contributing substance listed alongside it. In that scenario, the manner of death would most likely be classified as accidental rather than homicide. That middle ground possibility has not been prominently discussed in coverage of this case, and it deserves to be understood as a real and medically plausible outcome. There has been no suggestion from any source, official or otherwise, that Nolan used drugs that day, or that drugs played any role whatsoever in what happened to him. This scenario is being explained purely because it is part of the standard medical framework examiners have to work through and rule out, not because there is any specific evidence pointing toward it, in Nolan's case. This case is far from over. Toxicology results are still pending. The phone forensics have not been completed. The neck structures retained by the state have not been released to the independent pathologist. Every one of those outstanding pieces could fundamentally change what we understand about how Nolan Wells died. If you want to be here when those answers arrive, subscribe right now, hit the bell, turn on every notification. This channel will bring you every verified update the moment it can be confirmed. Stay with us. This story is not finished. Separate from everything contained in the autopsy report, there is first-hand testimony about the specific stretch of water where Nolan's body was discovered that reframes some of the central questions this case has produced. A representative from the United Cajun Navy, the volunteer search and recovery organization that assisted in locating Nolan, spoke in detail about the northwestern coastline of Horn Island where the body was found. His knowledge of that area does not come from reconstructing a single afternoon. It comes from repeated direct experience working those waters across multiple operations over time. His description was specific and unambiguous. The current in that particular section of the island is genuinely dangerous. Experienced individuals who work those waters regularly have developed their own informal name for it. They call it the washing machine, a name earned by the way the current rolls and churns unpredictably in that specific zone, capable of pulling a person under quickly and with very little warning. He also describes something that carries particular weight in the context of this case. In that exact stretch of shoreline, the water depth can shift from 2 or 3 feet to as much as 20 feet within just a few steps. That is not a gradual transition. That is an almost instantaneous change from water a person could comfortably stand in to depth that would immediately overwhelm anyone not expecting it, including a strong swimmer. The significance of that detail becomes clearest when placed against one of the questions that has been raised repeatedly since this case began. Attorney Ben Crump has asked, on multiple occasions, why no one among the reportedly large crowd present on the beach that day appeared to notice Nolan struggling or went to assist him. This first-hand account offers a technically grounded answer to that exact question. If the depth shifts as dramatically and as quickly as this experienced searcher describes, and if the current behaves the way he has seen it behave across many visits to that coastline, then the window between a person standing safely in shallow water and being pulled into something genuinely dangerous could be measured in seconds rather than minutes. Not a prolonged, visible struggle, not a drawn-out series of cries for help. Something faster, something quieter. There is a broader context from public health research on drowning that is relevant here, entirely separate from this specific case. Researchers who study drowning consistently note that real drowning events look almost nothing like the dramatic, splashing scenes most people picture, largely because those images come from how drowning is typically depicted in entertainment, rather than how it actually unfolds physiologically. In reality, a person who is actively drowning is often physically unable to call out or signal for help at all. The body's most fundamental priority in that moment is the basic mechanics of attempting to breathe. Every other voluntary movement becomes physiologically subordinate to that single survival function. From a distance, the result can look deceptively quiet. almost ordinary, right up until the moment it is too late. That reality does not prove what happened to Nolan Wells, but it does mean that the absence of an obvious, visible, chaotic struggle is not by itself evidence that something other than drowning must have occurred. Both outcomes, accidental drowning and something else, are compatible with a scene that looked, from a distance, like nothing at all. The same searcher described Nolan's body when it was found, face down, fully clothed, in roughly the same area where whatever happened to him most likely occurred. He noted that in that specific stretch of coastline, given the behavior of the currents there, finding a body relatively close to its point of entry into the water is not unusual. Bodies do not always drift far. In some conditions, they settle near where the incident began. This brings the geography of the case into sharper focus. The distress call placed by Nolan's friends, in which they reported their own boat was taking on water, was made near the western tip of Horn Island. Nolan's body was recovered at the northwestern tip. If this searcher's account of how bodies settle near their point of entry is accurate, that overlap becomes considerably more significant, potentially narrowing the location of whatever happened to Nolan down to a fairly specific stretch of coastline. The searcher was also asked directly about one of the more serious theories that has circulated in public discussion of this case: the possibility that Nolan's body may have been deliberately moved from somewhere else and placed in the water to make his death resemble a straightforward drowning. He did not dismiss the question, but he stated clearly that based on everything he observed during the recovery operation, he does not believe that is what happened. He then made a concrete, specific, and credentialed offer. His organization works with cadaver dogs, animals trained specifically to detect trace evidence of blood, even in situations where substantial cleaning has already been attempted. He offered those dogs directly to search the boat involved in this case, not as a symbolic gesture, as a practical forensic tool with a demonstrated track record. He referenced a previous case in Baton Rouge, in which his organization's cadaver dogs identified evidence connected to a homicide, evidence that directly contributed to an arrest. That prior outcome matters, because it means this offer comes with a real demonstrated history behind it, not simply a theoretical capability. Whether that offer has been formally accepted has not been confirmed publicly. That is an open question worth watching closely, because a specific, credible offer of forensic assistance from an organization with a proven track record, sitting unacknowledged in the public record, is exactly the kind of detail that deserves follow-up. The searcher also raised a straightforward logical question about the phone. If Nolan's friends had taken the phone with harmful intent, why keep it at all? Disposing of it on open water would have been easy and immediate. Keeping it creates a chain of possession that could be traced and questioned later. That is not proof of innocence, but it is a grounded question that deserves to sit alongside every other theory in this case. There are counter-arguments worth acknowledging. Disposing of a phone is itself a potentially suspicious act, one that, if later noticed, would immediately draw serious scrutiny. Keeping it could reflect an absence of guilty intent, or it could reflect a calculated decision that keeping it was the less conspicuous choice. Neither interpretation can be resolved on the basis of this detail alone, which is precisely why it remains genuinely open. Christine Wells has described a troubling discrepancy in the data from two location tracking tools that were active on Nolan's phone that day. Snapchat's built-in map feature and the Life 360 app both showed information about the phone's location, but they told different stories. One app updates its location data automatically and continuously. The other only registers a new location when someone actively opens the application. That fundamental difference in how each tool operates can explain some degree of inconsistency between what they show. But Christine's deeper concern goes beyond the location data itself. When she eventually had direct access to Nolan's phone, she found that there were no photographs from that day, no videos, no saved content. In a young man who habitually documented his experiences, especially during the kind of social outing a 4th of July trip to an island represents. The complete absence of any content from an entire afternoon raised serious questions. There is context worth adding honestly. Snapchat's default settings delete content automatically once it has been viewed. Even unopened content typically disappears after approximately 30 days. Users can also configure their accounts to delete content after just 24 hours, a setting some people enable without it reflecting any unusual behavior. Whether Nolan had that specific setting enabled has not been publicly confirmed, and it represents a meaningfully different scenario than content being deliberately deleted by someone else. A legal analyst who weighed in on this case made an important distinction. Everything currently known about the phone's contents comes from Christine's own account of what she observed when she examined the device. That is a sincere, concerned, potentially significant observation, but it is not the same thing as a trained digital forensics extraction that can definitively establish whether data was deleted, when it was deleted, and by what mechanism. The mutually agreed upon forensic phone inspection, which both sides have committed to, is the process actually capable of answering that question? The same analyst also raised a caution about location data more broadly. Consumer applications like Life 360 depend on network signal strength and connectivity. In a situation where multiple people are gathered closely together, each running their own devices simultaneously, those devices can interfere with each other's signal in ways that produce delayed, inconsistent, or imprecise location readings. Drawing firm investigative conclusions from consumer tracking applications ahead of a professional forensic download risks getting ahead of what the evidence can currently support. No discussion of this case's unresolved questions would be complete without returning to the contradiction that has been at its center from nearly the beginning. There are two competing accounts of what Nolan told people in the final conversation he had before he disappeared. The young woman he had been spending time with on the beach has stated that Nolan told her he intended to head back and rejoin the friends he arrived with on the boat. Those same friends have stated something different, that Nolan told them he wanted to stay behind with her. The surface-level reading of these two accounts is that they are mutually exclusive, that someone is not telling the truth. One commentator put it directly: both statements cannot simultaneously be accurate. But there is a more nuanced reading that deserves serious consideration. A defense attorney who analyzed this contradiction offered an alternative framework. He suggested both accounts could be partially accurate without either party being dishonest, depending on details that have not yet been publicly established. If Nolan had, in the course of that afternoon, encountered a second group of friends or acquaintances beyond those most publicly discussed, it is entirely conceivable that he told his original friends he would get a ride back with another group, while also telling the young woman he was heading back to a boat, meaning a different boat, a different plan. Two sincere statements about two different intentions, neither of which is a lie, but neither of which tells the complete picture. This becomes more plausible when you consider the context of that specific day. Horn Island on a 4th of July holiday hosted a crowd witnesses have estimated stretched into the hundreds. In a gathering of that scale, multiple friend groups, multiple boats, multiple social configurations crossing and reconnecting throughout the afternoon is entirely expected. Assuming Nolan's world on that beach consisted only of two groups may be an oversimplification that obscures a more complicated afternoon than has so far been publicly reconstructed. On the matter of the viral video, the footage that circulated widely and that many have interpreted as capturing Nolan in a confrontation shortly before his disappearance, genuine disagreement exists among people who were actually present. Some who have seen and heard it maintain the voice in the video belongs to Nolan. Others, including a friend who has spoken publicly and repeatedly on this exact question, insist the voice belongs to him, not Nolan, and that the dispute captured on the recording involved a completely separate matter, unrelated to anything that happened to Nolan that day. Ben Crump, when pressed directly on this question, was transparent about the uncertainty. He acknowledged that different witnesses have communicated different things to his team. He stated plainly that going forward, his team will be more careful to distinguish between what comes from a first-hand eyewitness account and what is being presented as established fact. That kind of transparency about the limits of what is known deserves acknowledgement. In the midst of all this forensic terminology and legal procedure, there is a human dimension of this story that must not be lost beneath the weight of technical detail. A licensed psychotherapist who has discussed Christine Wells's experience publicly used a specific clinical term to describe what this mother is living through: ambiguous loss. It is a recognized and studied form of grief, described by those who work with it as among the most psychologically difficult forms of loss that exist, precisely because it lacks the resolution that even the most devastating losses typically eventually provide. When someone we love dies in a way that is understood and documented, an illness, an accident with a clear cause, grief has what psychologists describe as a narrative to attach to. The mind can process a story, even when that story is painful. It can, over time, begin to integrate the loss, because the facts are settled. Grief still comes. It still hurts, but it has somewhere concrete to land. Ambiguous loss withholds that landing place entirely. Without a settled explanation, the mind cycles back to the same unanswered questions again and again, unable to complete the psychological work that grief ordinarily allows. The questions keep reopening. The wound cannot close because the story is not finished. Christine Wells's last concrete memory of her son is both simple and devastating in its ordinariness. A shared meal, a hug, a kiss, then silence. That specific memory has surfaced repeatedly across every format this case has been covered in. It keeps returning because it is the kind of detail that cuts through everything else. It reminds anyone paying attention that beneath every piece of forensic evidence discussed in this case, beneath every GPS coordinate and legal procedural development, is a mother's last ordinary evening with her son, an evening she had no reason to believe would be the last one. Forensic findings, investigative conclusions, and toxicology results are not only relevant to legal accountability in this case. For Christine and Elmore Wells, they are the only pathway toward something most people take entirely for granted: the ability to grieve in a way that has somewhere to go. Every delay in those results, every unanswered forensic question, every procedural gap is not only a matter of legal process moving slowly. It is an extension of a particular kind of suspended grief that has no end date and no natural resolution until the truth of what happened to their son is finally established. Back at that Chicago convention stage, NAACP President Derek Johnson did not confine his remarks to the medical findings Ben Crump had just read aloud. He delivered a direct and unambiguous public rebuke of how this investigation has been conducted. His words were measured, but unmistakable. He accused the relevant authorities of being derelict in their duty to ensure that regardless of what actually happened, a proper and thorough investigation was conducted. Johnson did not stand before that crowd and claim that the NAACP has concluded Nolan Wells was the victim of deliberate harm. He made a narrower but still serious argument that the quality of the investigation itself, independent of whatever its eventual findings turn out to be, has not met the standard this case and this family deserved. That is a distinction between a process accusation and an outcome accusation. He is not claiming to know the answer. He is arguing that the manner in which the people responsible for finding the answer have gone about their work falls short of what is required. The NAACP's direct national involvement, as opposed to regional or local chapter engagement, is itself a signal worth noting. That level of top-level institutional commitment does not happen quickly or casually. It reflects sustained internal deliberation about whether a specific case merits national attention and organizational resources. The fact that it has arrived here, nearly 3 weeks into this case, suggests the organization's leadership has concluded this situation rises to that level. The NAACP formalized that conclusion with a resolution calling on local, state, and federal authorities, explicitly including the Department of Justice, to conduct a complete and transparent review of the events surrounding Nolan's disappearance and death. Alongside that institutional pressure, the financial incentive for anyone with real information to come forward has grown substantially. The reward fund now stands at $125,000, jointly supported by Reverend Al Sharpton, entertainment executive Tyler Perry, and former NFL player Terrell Owens. The speed at which that figure has grown is notable. Just 2 days before the NAACP announcement, at Nolan's funeral, Reverend Sharpton had announced an initial $50,000 reward. In 48 hours, that figure more than doubled, with 2 additional prominent figures adding their own financial commitments. Ben Crump used the platform of that Chicago announcement to make specific forward-looking demands. He wants Dr. Mitchell to be given direct access to the state's own findings, including, most importantly, whatever the toxicology results show once they are completed. And he wants Mitchell included formally when this case is eventually presented before a Mississippi grand jury, so that the independent pathologist's perspective and findings are part of what that jury hears, rather than the grand jury receiving only the state's own examiner's account. That second request deserves scrutiny. Grand jury proceedings are typically structured around a single prosecutorial presentation, built from evidence gathered by official investigators. Bringing in an independently retained expert to offer supplementary or potentially competing forensic analysis in front of a grand jury would be unusual. Whether or not it is ultimately granted may become one of the most consequential procedural decisions in this entire case. Before this update ends, it is worth being precise about exactly where things stand. Not where public pressure wishes they stood, not where the most dramatic interpretation would place them, but where the evidence actually is. What is confirmed? A 12-inch by 8-inch area of unexplained red discoloration in the deep soft tissue at the back of Nolan Wells's head. No skull fractures, no lacerations, no toxicology yet from either the state or the independent examination. A second autopsy structurally limited by the fact that key neck structures had already been retained by the state, and a forensic pathologist who has formally stated that he cannot rule out injury to the neck as a potential contributor to or cause of death. What remains genuinely open, whether that discoloration was caused by another person, by the drowning process itself, by decomposition, or by handling during recovery. Whether the neck structures retained by the state would have shown anything relevant, even if Mitchell had had access to them. And whether toxicology, once it finally arrives, will point toward accident, toward a more complex combination of factors, or toward something else, the evidence has not yet surfaced. One distinction deserves to be restated clearly, because it is the single most important thing to take away from everything discussed tonight. An unexplained finding is not the same as a confirmed cause. A pathologist who says he cannot rule out foul play is saying something meaningfully different from a pathologist who says he has found evidence of foul play. Both of those statements are simultaneously true right now, and both deserve to be held with precision, rather than collapsed into each other. This case has already been damaged before, by exactly that kind of collapse. Claims treated as facts before they were verified. Contested footage treated as confirmed evidence. Witness accounts described with more certainty than they deserved. Tonight's findings deserve a more careful standard than that, regardless of how significant the number 12 by 8 inches sounds in isolation. What this case has produced tonight, when everything is taken together, is this: the first genuinely documented physical evidence from inside Nolan Wells's body. A pathologist who has been transparent about both what he found and what he could not examine. An institutional infrastructure of demand, legal, civil rights, financial, that has grown considerably since this investigation began. and a set of outstanding forensic questions that represent the clearest path forward toward the answers this family requires. Nolan Wells was 18 years old. He disappeared on a 4th of July holiday on a Mississippi island. 3 weeks later, his parents sit with a preliminary autopsy report that tells them something they did not know before and still leaves the most fundamental question, what actually happened to their son, formally unanswered. For Christine and Elmore, this finding is not a resolution. It is not peace. It is one more concrete piece of an incomplete picture, slowly being assembled into something that can eventually tell the full story of what happened on that island and in that water. The toxicology results will come. The phone forensics will move forward. The question of the retained neck structures will either be addressed through the access Crump is demanding, or it will become a permanent gap in what the independent examination was able to accomplish. And this case will continue to be covered here, with the same precision, the same insistence on the difference between what is confirmed and what is claimed, and the same commitment to following the facts wherever they actually lead. That is the only way to cover a story like this one. Not with certainty the evidence does not yet support, not with conclusions drawn before the investigation is complete, but with honesty about exactly where things stand, and exactly what still needs to be answered before anyone, on any side of this case, can truthfully say they know what happened to Nolan Wells. If this reporting gave you something that most coverage of this case has not, precision, honest context, and a clear-eyed read of what the evidence actually says, then this channel is where you need to be for every update that follows. Subscribe right now. Turn on notifications. Share this video with someone who is following this case, because Nolan Wells' family deserves for people to stay focused on the facts, and that is exactly what this channel is committed to doing, for as long as it takes to get to the truth.